Hi, it's Nicole, and after an unintentional break, I'm going to be continuing today with my low impact challenge updates. In these past 2 weeks, I learned about the extent to which the government is swayed by the fossil fuels industry and therefore impeded from limiting the huge negative impact from these fossil fuel companies. I learned about the ideology of extractivism and how it's often founded on imperialist or even racist ideas. I also learned that there is no shortage of viable options to halt or limit, and in some cases reverse, the damage that we've done within the window we have before reaching the tipping point of no return. I found out that it might actually be possible to power the entire world 100% on renewables by 2030 if we act immediately. Germany is already well on its way to being 100% powered by renewables and plans to phase out nuclear by the year 2022, so that's very soon. Sadly, it seems like they also still mine coal and sell it abroad, which is a whole other set of really frustrating circumstances and hypocrisies. Disappointingly, I also learned that Big Green and the left generally have been complicit in Earth's destruction due to inaction or an unwillingness to confront failed free market thinking or challenge the status quo. More than that, Big Green is sometimes even directly involved in doing the kind of damage that you would expect only to find from fossil fuel companies. I found it interesting that Naomi Klein suggests that we are disconnected from each other, disconnected from a sense of place, and disconnected from a sense of long-term generational time by our devices and virtual worlds. The constant slew of updates of what is happening now in our digital feeds is distracting us from the slow-moving and intensely place-based warning signs of the changing climate. And all of that sort of wraps up the first third of the book. It's kind of a discouraging thing to learn about all of these really negative facts, but at the same time I feel like knowing about that can actually be really helpful. And it's frustrating to think that there's just a lack of courage that is preventing us from actually doing anything that needs to be done. And to me, it doesn't feel like overall there's a whole lot of personal sacrifice that's being asked for, and certainly not any more sacrifice than we're already making in favor of free market capitalism. So anytime there are things like cuts to public services or cuts to pensions or, like she mentions in the book, children elsewhere in the world having to go to school with masks on because the air pollution is so bad, or any things like that. Those are sacrifices that we as the general public are having to make in our everyday lives in favor of the free market and what we hope is a greater good that will trickle down wealth and other good, happy things. That to me just says that it's not as if people are unwilling to make those kinds of sacrifices. It's more that the sacrifices that we're making in favor of capitalism feel very normalized at this point, and so we just continue doing those things, although I think that also has a breaking point. But any new kinds of sacrifices in favor of being greener can feel a lot like hypocrisy when the average person is being asked to sacrifice more and we're not seeing those sacrifices being made at the top end from big companies and government regulation and that kind of thing. With the weather getting a little bit warmer and sunnier, we went on a few walks these last 2 weeks. I'm really excited every time summer comes around and everything comes to life and it's all really lush and green and beautiful everywhere. In the interest of reducing our plastics just a little bit, we learned to make tortillas. That way we won't have to buy the over-processed and plastic packaged tortillas that we normally would have bought, and the ones that we've made, the recipe is super easy, and I'll leave the one that I used down below. And also it tastes really good. I've also started sharing a few tips on my Instagram that are hopefully really manageable and easy to do. It's mostly just changing of methods and habits, and they are actions that don't require any purchases, which is really important to me because I think the idea of just purchasing green is not necessarily that helpful. And I found out that there's actually a lot that we can do in those habit change actions that can make a really big difference, whereas buying something that's a little bit greener that you weren't going to already buy is not necessarily as helpful. I think having the option to buy greener products is great if you were already going to buy those things, but I also feel like there's a wealth of that information already available, and I don't see as often people talking about changing the ways that you're doing things. If there's one major thing that I've learned in the first part of this book, it's that Even though advances in green technology are fantastic, they can do nothing unless we are actually changing the ways that we do things. One thing that made me feel like I do have the power to have a big effect is when my boyfriend was talking about how now that we've switched to getting all of our fruit and veg from the greengrocer, even though we're just two people, our regular patronage every week to that greengrocer could actually be keeping their lights on, literally paying their utilities at the end of every month. And that to me is really powerful, especially when we consider that going to the big food store where we used to get our produce doesn't make a difference to them whether we are there or not. And also it feels like we are potentially supporting things that we might not want to support. On the other side of that, going to this small business means that we can actually have a really huge effect, and just us as a couple going there regularly could possibly be the difference between them staying in our neighborhood or not. So while our humble produce purchase means nothing to one of the big food stores that we may have got our produce from in the past, it could mean so much to one of these tiny little greengrocers where we could literally be paying for their utilities every month with a purchase that we have to make every week anyway. Realizing what a huge difference that little change may have already made me feel really proud, and like the actions that I do, even if they're really small, might actually have a really big effect to my surroundings. I thought I'd add a little thing in about questions that I'm still asking myself. I haven't come to any conclusions on, and I'm just sharing some thoughts that I had. I think I'll probably come up with solutions for some of these questions just the more I read and research, but here are some things that were on my mind. Is it better to buy local even if that product comes in unrecyclable packaging, or to buy something that comes in recyclable packaging or no packaging at all, even if it is imported and therefore coming with extra transport emissions? Is buying imported food better than buying local if the food was grown in season where it has been imported from, whereas locally it was grown out of season and therefore needed energy-intensive greenhousing? And finally, some documentaries I wanted to share. Catching the Sun is about energy, renewables, solar, fossil fuels. Sustainable covers food production, industrial agriculture, additives, organic, soil. Knock Down the House covers US government, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, fossil fuels, social justice, among other things. This is very American-centric, but I think, especially when talking about climate change, America is one of the big players in all of this and can have a huge effect on things, and it's interesting to see how, looking at how much governments play a role in this, positively and negatively, it seems like a really important thing that you can't really escape. Chasing Coral looks at oceans and warming-induced coral bleaching, which I actually feel really bad that I didn't know more about already, being from the Bahamas, which is actually one of the places that they went to in the documentary to capture some of this coral bleaching. I've tried to put in as many of my thoughts as I possibly can, and I've done it in a way that's a little bit more structured. Hopefully that works a little better than last time, which was a bit more haphazard, and hopefully it doesn't feel too stiff. I'm so glad that the last video was received so positively. If you have any comments on how I can make these kinds of updates on my low impact challenge more interesting or engaging or useful or informative or anything like that, please leave that down below, because I'd like these videos to be helpful as well as interesting. And I don't know if the personal aspects are useful or not. I feel like for me, when I see other people talking about how they're doing these things in their own lives, that's kind of helpful to see different models of how things could work. And I think it's interesting to hear about questions that people might have that I may not have thought of, or that I also have, and it's just a little bit reassuring in a way to think that somebody else also has this concern, and it's not something that everyone else has already figured out and no one is talking about because it's so obvious. But again, if any of that is completely useless or uninteresting, then let me know that as well. But that's it for today, and I hope that wasn't too long. And I'll see you again next time. Bye!